Thank you for joining and welcome to Lead Dev Bookmarked. Lead Dev is a global community of engineering leaders who come together to discuss all things leadership, teams, tools, and tech. Bookmarked is our monthly book club that takes place on the first Tuesday of every month. Our sessions cover an array of engineering and leadership books that our awesome Lead Dev audience can draw insights and practical experiences from. I'm Suzan Bond, and I'll be your moderator for this discussion. I'm a former COO of a scaling startup and an executive coach. My specialty is tech leaders. You can find me on Twitter using my name. Today, we'll be talking about DevOps for Dummies. If you have questions for Emily Freeman, who I've just been talking to, please pop them in the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we'll try to answer them as we go. And just a note, we will not be going over to the Lead Dev Slack this week. So if you do want to ask a question, now is your time to pop it into Zoom, and our helpful moderators will get them to me. Emily is a technologist and a storyteller who helps engineering teams improve their velocity. As the author of DevOps for Dummies, she believes the biggest challenges facing developers aren't technical, but human. Her mission in life is to transform technology organizations by creating company cultures in which diverse, collaborative teams can thrive. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm super happy to be here. And I just wanted to thank everyone who's joining. This is awesome.
Yeah, I'm so happy to have you here. Oh, and it looks like our captioner has joined, which is fantastic. So we can get some closed captions going. Great. Just before we started our conversation. So, I've been really excited to have you on. I've been following you on Twitter and we've chit-chatted, and I'm really excited to hear more. And if anyone who knows me even a little bit, I love a good behind the scenes peek at how things are made. Yes. So I'd love to start, how did you get into DevOps?
Mm-hmm. So I came very circuitously to tech in general. I had multiple careers beforehand. So I went to school for politics. I'm from DC. Politics is my first love. It's what I'll always be passionate about. But one particular party in the United States doesn't pay well. And so I was like, okay, well, this isn't going to work. So I ran through a bunch of other things. Like I worked in PR and community management, community relations, that type of thing. I ended up raising money for some nonprofits. And then I sort of took a side job editing a self-published novel. And I'm sure that first one was pretty rough. I really feel bad for that author. But I got better and better and better. And then I started writing and ghostwriting for these authors and then entrepreneurs and various folks. And so I kind of fell into this writing and editing. It's where my Twitter handle, Editing Emily, came from. That was my little business. But then I had my daughter. And for anyone who's a parent, that, children, especially that first child, really kind of shakes up your whole life. And so I had to make some changes, and, some things were happening personally that I needed to shift things around. So I decided, okay, well, what are the good career options? And particularly, I wanted to support my daughter who pays well. So I was like, well, software engineers, they seem to make a lot of money. How hard could it be? Which,
I love
the
that.
Hubris, Susan, the sheer hubris.
How hard could it be?
What's wrong with you?
Keyboarding. I already keyboard.
Yeah, exactly. So I went over, there was this little mini conference held by Arlington Ruby, because I was in DC at the time. I will always love that group. Rubyists in general are some of the most wonderful humans in tech.
I got into tech too, by the way, was through Ruby. So
see, that community, I haven't seen one yet that matches just the sheer friendliness and openness and willingness to help. They're just amazing.
I met my husband that way, by the two. Just to interrupt. I met my husband on Twitter through the Ruby community.
I love it. See, Ruby.
Yep. Okay. So anyway, back to you.
So I went and I was trying to learn some things, but I'm also not someone who's particularly self-motivated. We can talk about that when we talk about how I wrote the book. But I kind of need people to make me feel guilty or to be disappointed if I don't deliver. That's my motivation, sheer guilt. And
good
so,
yes,
I know. I at one point had my editor I was like, I need you to send me saints, like send me pictures of saints when I'm late, And at some point she sent Mother Teresa, and I was like, oh, this is over. I am way late.
That's delightful.
But yeah. So anyway, I was struggling to learn and like self-teach. So I decided to go to code school. I thought I'd go to DC or maybe commute to New York. But the folks at Arlington were like, you got to go to Denver. The best one's in Denver. Just like, what? So yeah, I kind of picked up everything, including my 6-month-old daughter, and moved to Denver, went to code school. So learned Ruby, got a job in Java. And it was at that job that I really started to feel this friction that we now, attempted to fix with DevOps. And this sort of, in the traditional engineering culture, developers and operations folks, they were completely separate. And there was this wall, we just kind of batted things at each other. So I was developing something like some kind of carousel with hero images, and there was an issue. And when I was digging into the logging, it looked like maybe some kind of CDN issue or something, but I was blocked. I couldn't actually even read certain logs. So I had to go to the ops folks, and I was like, I think this is an ops issue, an infra issue. Like, I need the logs. They're like, no, it's a code issue. Clearly it's your problem. And I was like, no, it's not. So basically, like after 3 or 4 back and forth with that, I went and sort of angry typed my first talk abstract, Humpty Dumpty, a story of DevOps gone wrong. And just kind of dug into it. That's sort of how I fell into DevOps, and really kind of focusing on more of the human interaction and the culture around DevOps and engineering teams in general than, the pure infrastructure and, technology around operations.
I love that. And that you rage created a talk out of that. Maybe I put rage in there, but like angrily typing.
Rage can be very motivating.
It sure can. I feel like that's some of my best stuff, is when I'm just like frustrated about something and it flies out of me, and then it becomes something that other people relate with too.
Oh my gosh.
Well, so how did the book then come about, DevOps for Dummies?
So the book was a couple years later. So at that point I had done plenty of writing and kind of work in DevOps. A friend of a friend was an editor at Wiley, who is the big publisher for the imprint of Dummies. And so, they were like, well, we're missing DevOps. We know there's a market for it. Would you like to write it? And it's, I don't know that I fully believe in this sort of dream boarding concept, but I have found that, like, if you put something into the universe, it will come back. And so like a couple of years before, I had said, I want to write a book. I want to write my own book, with my name on it. Cause I've written for other people, with their names on it. I wanted something for me. And so, I had kind of put that into the universe, and then it kind of came back. So I was like, hell yes, I absolutely want to write this book. And so they were like, well, can it be done in 6 months? And again, the hubris, Suzan, I was like, sure. Yeah, no problem. I was like, bad decision-making, real bad. Did not do it. Yeah.
Well, and I'm curious. I will admit I'm not a huge fan of the For Dummies sort of series. Like, I'm just not. It just doesn't seem to be my style. There's nothing wrong with it. But I actually loved this. Like, I thought it was really fantastic. I thought it elevated the material. And I was just curious, out of my own personal curiosity, like, did you care about, did you like the Dummies series? Was there something you wanted to innovate? Or did you just say, I want this information in the world, and whatever the company is or the style is, I'm going to do it?
Yeah, it was twofold, right? I wanted definitely to be able to have a platform on which to be able to kind of speak to people and really get the information out there. But also selfishly, like, I think sometimes we keep waiting for opportunities to be perfect. And, if I were to design things like, I would not necessarily go with the Dummies brand. But it was the book that came to me. And so I was like, okay, here we go. And I'll say that, from my knowledge around this and then previously, publishers, first-time authors are very nerve-wracking because you don't know that they're going to finish, right? Like,
right.
And it's hard. Like, I don't want to underestimate or kind of undersell. Writing a book is one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life, period. Like, it was brutal. And so finishing is huge. But if you have that first book, if you are a published author, it's much easier to get additional book deals because they can see, okay, you finished, your writing's good, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'm writing a book myself. So I mean, I don't have an agent or anything like that, but like, I totally hear that. So that's great advice for me. Okay. Check.
Yeah, definitely. And even
anybody.
self-publish. I mean, even especially in tech, because we have a niche audience, people are making plenty of money, definitely more money self-publishing than publishing traditionally.
Oh yeah. Yep. I've self-published, didn't make a lot, but like, yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, there are definitely examples of people who have done that. Yeah. Thank you for answering my question about that. You know, that was like such an interesting sort of like, I think it's the first time we've had a For Dummies sort of thing. And in some of my own stereotypes and thoughts about that series that, you know, probably has held me back from other writing. And because I knew you, I thought, oh, I bet this is going to be really fantastic. And it really was. Like, it had the right amount of detail, and I felt like it didn't talk down, but actually the material was quite, you know, broad, but understandable, but never talking down.
Thank you. And I will say this for the Dummies brand, they do force you to write for someone who doesn't have any kind of concept of what it is. Right. So you have to really adjust your language and your jargon and really think about things. It was a good exercise.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure it was. Okay. So I want to dig into the material now. I mean, I'm as you talk about, it's very human, and, you know, DevOps stuff it's really, I always love to say, like, I think the hardest part of tech is the human parts. I think we agree on that. Yes. I'm not saying the technology is not hard. There definitely are tricky problems, and, you know, technical debt and all that. There are problems, but is a human part. And so what's the hardest part that folks might run into when trying to convince others to try DevOps, like at the organization?
Yeah, I think fear. Yeah, I think humans, change is dangerous, you know, and we have to deal with the way we live now is so vastly different than the majority of the time humans have been in existence, right? And so you have to kind of keep in mind this sort of evolution of our brains and how we kind of function. And when we feel fear, and change can sort of ignite that feeling, it's not just this like cognitive, intellectual experience. It's you feel it here, it's in your body, you're scared, you're unsure. What does this mean for the future? And the instinct is just stop, right? Like, just no, stop, to be safe. And so when you kind of hit that change, or you're suggesting something big, and for some organizations, a change to DevOps can feel really, really big. There's just this initial like, no. And so what I always recommend is, you know, persuasion is really important, and it's not something that comes naturally to a lot of us. A lot of us may have a negative connotation with persuasion because we think of it as manipulation. But for me, like, persuasion is really taking someone on a journey with you. It's enabling them to see a situation or a moment or a story through your eyes. And if you can really kind of do that with your colleagues and take small pieces, you know, don't necessarily go to your org and say, we have to completely scrap what we're doing. We're doing it all wrong. We have to do the DevOps. That's going to get probably a negative reaction, rather than saying, you know, I think that this one little project or work in progress or whatever, I think it could be better approached if we did X, Y, and Z. I'm going to experiment with us. Are you interested in helping? And go from there.
Yeah, peel off something smaller and more bite-sized. I know I was just talking with someone who they want to immerse their developers in the pains of their audience. And so they first said 80%, and I said, no, okay, I'm just going to pick this one thing. And for 1 month, we're going to take initiative, and we're going to really feel on this one project, we're going to feel the pains of our customer to see, because they're in the developer tool space. Yeah. And I thought, what a brilliant way to go about that. It's kind of what you're talking about.
Yeah. It's absolutely like just that exposure and appreciation is huge.
That's so great. Well, and when we're doing experiments, right, measurement is always sort of important. How do we know if we're being successful, other than just, you know, our emotional sides of things, you know, how we feel about it, you know, our opinions and all the stuff that happens inside our human brains. Sure. So, you know, what are some ways that folks might consider quantifying their DevOps efforts?
Yeah, I think measuring, and it's so interesting because in tech in particular, we have this desire to always have data, and beyond data, quantitative data, right? We like the numbers, we like the black and white, the yes and no kind of situation. Qualitative data is also data. And so, you know, as long as you're being consistent in how you collect information, that can be useful as well. So that for me, the big point is you just have to measure, and that includes hitting a baseline. So wherever you're at in your journey as an engineering team, just measuring specific things. And don't overthink it, right? I think sometimes we get into analysis paralysis over really silly things like, well, what are the data points that are going to prove this? It's like, it doesn't really matter. What you want to see is improvement across the board. And so take, you know, whatever it may be, you know, sometimes it would be, if you're having trouble with incidents and they're taking forever, you could try something like time to recovery or time to remediation. That would help. You could take something more closer to like an SLI, SLO, service level indicator, service level objective, where you're really looking at, you know, how long does this service take to respond? What is this type of experience? So there's a variety of different approaches, and there's tons of information around this. But the real trick is before you start, take a baseline of set data. Be very clear about when you took it, where you took it, why you took it. And then at regular intervals, keep measuring those specific pieces of data. And then you'll have something to measure at the end of it, some kind of showcase of movement, of improvement. And two things with this also. Getting people's opinions, like writing them down and really kind of tracking how people do feel about something at that specific time, right? Because our memory is very untrustworthy. So making sure we write something down at a period of time and we kind of like keep track of it like that would be useful. But yeah, don't get too hung up on specific things. Just make sure you're actually tracking and, you know, seeing that sort of improvement and journey. The other thing with that is you want to be aware that change over the long term can be really impressive. Change at the start is really slow because you're also figuring out what's broken. And sometimes you lift up a rock and there's just a mess underneath, right? And so there can actually be a dip at the start. Don't give up. You know, sometimes maybe you found like a major security vulnerability, or you figured out, you know, one of your services is like the tests are super brittle. Whatever the issue is, taking the time to stop and fix that, it will pay off later, but just don't be shocked if there's a bit of a dip or a slow track upward when you first start.
That's great advice. I mean, who doesn't love a good before and after? You know, like those before and after photos. I mean, I am like all about them. And that's like, I think that's what you're encouraging is like in the beginning, you know, and making sure to take those photos, so to speak, those organizational photos as you go along, because over time you will really see the change, which will probably help you sell more things in the future to the company around how do we take on more of these kinds of initiatives.
Yes, absolutely. And I also I think sometimes developers and operations folks, what engineers of all kinds, they sort of undersell their value in this. So we are expensive and the more you can accelerate your productivity, the better off the company will be. And so if you discover things, like don't be afraid to take the time to automate those manual tasks or kind of resolve what we would call toil. That will pay off also pretty significantly. So just, you know, pay attention to you and your experience as an engineer as well.
Well, yeah. And I love what you said in there too, was, you know, I was thinking about qualitative data and I thought, oh, well, how people feel using the system, you know, interacting, going through a process, that's great qualitative data because we can't forget that humans are part of the system. So that, because I was going to ask about what's in qualitative data. I'm like, oh, there you go. How people feel. That's relevant.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Or, and even, I'll take incidents, right? If you have, because that's something we all deal with that will never go away. Incidents are just part of running a complex system. How you approach incidents and specifically incident management and recovering from those can make a huge difference on, you know, that's where you can really get really interesting information from engineers, where you have those sort of post-incident reviews and people are expressing not only what they didn't do, what they expected versus what was actually the issue or what happened. You're also showing, you know, were these people confident? Were they unsure of themselves? Did they have access to everything they needed in that moment? Is there someone on the team that is the only person that knows something in particular? That's a problem. You can really kind of highlight some of these areas, including psychological safety. Do they feel safe enough to admit, hey, I made this mistake. I miscalculated this. This was an issue. That's super important to being able to dig into the actual, contributing factors to an issue. So yeah, that's where that sort of qualitative data is really interesting and really important.
Yeah. Thank you for blowing that out a little bit. I think that's really useful to see both sides, qualitative and quantitative, how important they both are when it comes to measurement.
Yes.
So you have this chapter. I mean, it's like maybe one of my favorite chapter titles I've ever heard, which is DevOps isn't a title, except when it is.
Yes.
Love that. I'm just wondering if you can tell me a little bit more about about the way folks can organize their teams to support or build a DevOps culture. And what do you mean by that title for folks who haven't read the book?
Yeah. So there's this, the ship has sailed on job titles and having DevOps in them. I think when DevOps first came to be sort of part of tech, 2008, 2009, the concept was much more pure, right? It was this idea and this methodology, this sort of approach where you are going to take people and share experiences and share knowledge and really kind of bridge this gap. But organizations and managers and people in general, we have to have a way of organizing things. We're not super good with this very ephemeral type of experience or knowledge. And so they started to organize themselves around this concept of DevOps. And there's two main approaches that I see. One is integrating DevOps into a team. So that can be whether you have one or two people who are more operations focused on a feature team or sort of whatever it is, front end team, back end team, however you organize. You can also have developers who sort of, own what they build and are knowledgeable enough about operations in that particular system to support things and maintain going forward. The other side is to have specifically a team that is focused on this. Sometimes it's operations team, a DevOps team, a platform team. It comes by many different names. And so they're sort of separate from this other folks, but they in an ideal world would create tooling and systems that are more centralized that then can be used by other teams and are extensible through these other service teams, et cetera. So the point is there's tons of these iterations on organizationally how teams kind of organize around DevOps. Part of this was around salaries, right? I mean, there was a point where if you added DevOps to your title, it was a $50,000 boost. Go get your money. I don't care what it takes, get your raise. I think that's great. And you're kind of seeing the same thing a little bit with SRE now, Site Reliability Engineer. Yep. If you have that in your title, you're going to make more money, especially at Google. So there's sort of that. And yeah, it's just how it proceeds. So sometimes it's going to be in your title. That's not necessarily wrong. It just wasn't what was intended at the start of something. It was a natural consequence. But I think that's kind of, for me, in all experiences, including writing a book, when you put something out into the universe, it changes. It's no longer part of you. It is its own thing and people absorb it and morph it, and it's beautiful. So the evolution of DevOps and how it's kind of happened, I think it's really interesting. And I'll never begrudge people putting DevOps in their title.
I love that. And we have a question from the audience, slightly on this note, but this is from Matt. My organization has accepted that it should be looking to DevOps prior to my joining. However, it has enacted it by employing a DevOps person, which to me just move, and there's air quotes in there, just move the split of developers and operations to a different place. It hasn't actually solved the culture challenge we need to address. How do you recommend I go about resetting expectations so I can start getting us moving in the right direction? It feels harder to take a step back than it would have been from the scratch, to start from scratch.
Yeah. I don't know about you, Suzan. Have you ever seen a reorg solve an organizational cultural problem?
I mean, I'm as former COOs. We are known for our reorg.
I know. I was formerly at Microsoft. Believe me, I know a thing or two about reorgs. I think, sometimes it can be helpful, but it doesn't solve those big issues. And so, Matt, you're seeing that exactly thing happen right now. I think it's unfair to that person because they're then almost a scapegoat. They're going to take all that load, and the expectations that are on that role, I imagine, are way out of bounds and unfair. And so my best advice on short-term solutions would be to team up with that person and really kind of connect on what are they super knowledgeable about? Could they help teach, the developers, the other engineers on the teams, how to better support and manage their software or services? I would talk about sharing, on-call duty. I really hope and pray that this person is not the only person on call. But if they are, fix that. That's not fair at all. So really it's about, at that point, if there's just one person, I think that person almost needs to become a teacher and really start sharing information, or they're going to burn out real fast.
I like what you're talking about, because I think you're talking to the problem that these are like not just human problems, but organizational problems. Yeah. And that I mean, my husband works in the infrastructure, platform world. So like I hear about this every day. And I coach a lot of folks in those worlds. I think we don't recognize, like when they hire a DevOps person, they're not really recognizing the organizational shifts that are really outside, to your point, that are outside of that person's control.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's sort of passing the buck, and it's kind of a cheap fix from a leadership perspective, because fixing the systemic issues, it's harder, it's messier, it takes more time. It doesn't, get filed on the quarterly report. And so it takes some gumption as a leader to think more long-term and think about a 2-year success rather than a quarterly or sort of biannual success. But yeah, I mean, Matt's on, I think, is just fixing it from there and really kind of partnering with that person and making sure they don't burn out. And that we kind of spread the load would be my first advice.
That's really great practical advice. So this is just sort of an interesting, this is just something interesting I noted in the book. I always like to find one thing that I'm like, oh, that's interesting. So you talk about the greatest challenges as not being technical, but sociotechnical. So as a former sociology major, I was like, oh, I love that term. Yes. Can you tell me more like what you mean by that?
Yeah. I mean, so groups of people are fascinating. I missed an opportunity to be a sociologist or even an anthropologist. Like, I'm just obsessed with humans. I think they're fascinating. I think we're beautiful and weird, and we make really messy, strange decisions. Sometimes we're awful. Other times it's like this shining example of goodness. And I find the bandwidth just fascinating. And so what I mean by that sociotechnical system, we are part of the system. We are part of the, system that creates all of these applications and services and software for our customers. We've put our imprint on it in multiple different ways, but specifically, if you have a group of 5 people, so let's say 2 groups of 5 people, and you take one person from each group and swap them, the 2 groups will be different groups. Even though 4 people will still be there holding the culture, it will be a fundamentally different group, and it will behave differently. And that one person will have impact on how that group dynamic exists. And so our systems, the socio part of it, is constantly changing because we take different jobs. We do live reorgs, people get promoted, an engineer moves into tech leader and management. All of that changes the dynamic, and having an understanding of the system, the culture that you want and aspire to versus the culture that you have. Those are 2 things are almost never the same. And that's okay. We aspire to be better. You should aspire to be better. You're not always going to hit it. That's all right. But really kind of taking that harder look at yourself and just being aware that the only thing constant is change. It's going to keep shifting, and looking at it with curiosity, not fear, and sort of engaging and continuing to move toward your goals, I think is the big part of that.
Well, and I could be wrong, but I make up when I hear that term that it's like taking all of that, knowing that humans and orgs are dynamic and constantly changing, taking that into technological decisions that you need to make.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, you could even take it further. The user is part of that system. And so, I mean, I think we've all experienced, we make some kind of application, the user takes it and they do something we would have never, it's like, wait, what? What are you doing with my app? Like,
there's an edge case.
Okay. So they're going to influence that as well, and so they create this thing. It's just, humans, we're all over it, and we're very messy, and just kind of being open and curious about that messiness really kind of helps with, I think, DevOps and applying it to that system.
That's so great. I want to go to, you end the book with some top, DevOps pitfalls. Like I always love, I love lists like that. I'm like, ooh, tell me what are the mistakes that I might be stepping into. Yeah. I'm curious, what's one that might surprise people?
Yeah. Let's see. Honestly, I think giving up. I think people, there's plenty of advice in the book. There's plenty of advice on the internet. But I think having the tenacity to keep going through tough situations, through tough leadership decisions, through engineering setbacks, whatever may come your way, to not give up and to not view yourself or your work as a failure, right? We're not measuring this in 6 months. And at the end of that 6 months, you have to be a success. In that moment, it might have failed, but that's just a moment. It's a glimpse of a journey. And so if you keep moving, you're always going to improve, even if it's super slow, even if there are setbacks. Long-term, you will improve. That doesn't mean, however, staying in a toxic job, putting up with an awful boss. So you have to make those calls, but not really quitting on yourself, right? If you believe in something and you think that this is going to help not only you be a better engineer, help your team, your colleagues be better developers, your leaders be better leaders, your users have a better experience, whatever it is, just keep going.
Well, and again, I'm a human, so I make stuff up in my mind. But what I make when you say that too is that not giving up means that I think that change takes time. And when it comes to organizations, something like DevOps, I think is like organizational change. Yeah. And so organizational change takes time. And so if we give up too soon, I mean, again, we don't want to go over burnout and terrible bosses and terrible situations. But if we give up too soon, right, like we are missing that the change might be slow and that there might be eventually, like it might take a while and there might be a hockey stick, or that it might go back and forth, and change is not always like this.
Yes. Well, and I think this is tangential, but recently, especially because we're all changing jobs, and that's awesome. Go get your money. But there's this tendency or belief I've started to notice where people want to be associated with upswings, and this is natural, right? This, like, we all want good things on our resume. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think we also all know people who happen to be in the right place at the right time, and they don't come away with interesting lessons. They're not particularly talented in their area. They just were associated with success. They weren't the cause of success. I am much more interested in the people who have grit and who really stick with something and build something interesting, or take a problem and unpack it. Even if it's a small aspect of an issue, I'm not expecting anyone, including myself, I can't change the behemoths that I work for. Like, one person is never going to impact 100,000 person company in this massive way, but I can make my team better. I can improve a single process. And having those stories to really tell about how you impacted and how you stuck through hard problems, that is interesting. As a hiring manager, that's what I'm curious about. Not someone who has the glitz and the glam, because that's shine. And shine is exciting, but shine is worthless if there's not substance, right? So build substance as well.
Right. Well, and you and I are both, I will just say at a point in our career where we can realize like just getting through success, you get to a point where that starts to top out for you. And people, you're not getting the grit and the resilience and how do I work through really challenging, not just technical, but human problems that actually gives you the later promotions and things that you really want as you get further in your career. Somewhere to mid-career-ish, people hit a wall around that, at least in my experience.
Definitely.
I see that over and over.
Yeah. And the people who don't stick with that and who really don't invest in themselves and trust that they're going to learn something from it, these are the ones that end up with the fancy titles, but no one respects them because it's like, well, what are you doing? Like it's empty, right? They don't have that grit and that substance. So yeah, I'm hoping that doesn't become a trend because we need talented people who work hard. That's never going to go away.
Yeah. I love how we tied that to DevOps. So just a couple more questions before I leave us. This conversation has gone so fast. I could keep talking forever with you. Yeah. You developed a model that you call Revolution. Can you tell us a little bit more about like why you developed it and how it works?
Yeah. So, I started thinking about, there's been murmurs for the last couple of years, and this last couple of years have been an odd number of years, but I think people have started to think, okay, well, what's next, right? We had Agile, we did Agile. You can make arguments about how successful we do Agile, but there's
and people do.
Yes, it's quite the conversation topic to throw out there. And then we had DevOps and, okay, well, we've done the DevOps, like we have a great thing. And for some engineering teams who are really, really on top of things and they're really high performers and they have the resources to really go heavy and invest in things, they're sort of like, okay, we did it. Cool. This works better. Now what? Like, what's the next improvement? And especially like the companies that I typically work at, you're thinking about the cutting edge, you're thinking about what's next, you're thinking about what's coming up in 10 years, not what's happening right now. And so I started thinking about, okay, well, what follows DevOps? And I really spent a ton of time thinking about it. And I got kind of stuck, Susan, because it was like, that's a big question, by the way. And it's not one that one human, I don't think, can answer, right? And so I started to, do what engineers do. We break down this really big issue into smaller parts. And the more I thought about it, the more I kept getting stuck on the SDLC, the software development lifecycle, what we talk about all the time. And for someone who's like, yeah, it's ubiquitous, but we don't use it. Yes, we do. We use it every day in our language. We talk about moving security left in DevOps. Well, moving security left assumes the SDLC, that you have this linear path that you actually build things out in. And so making sure that we kind of have a model that reflects the nature of our work is important. And so I started to get into this. The SDLC was actually invented in the 60s. It's more for manufacturing of material goods than software as we now have it. And I wanted something that would have parallel processes that wouldn't necessarily be linear, that would have the ability to have pivots and show progress or setbacks in a way that anyone could understand. And so what I settled on is the Revolution model, and I'm sure we can link to GitHub or whatever, but it's really talking about different roles. So for me, personas, we use that word a ton, but it doesn't really capture our work anymore. You might have the title of developer, but do operations work or security, whatever it is. And so we have these roles that we take on. And so it has these concentric circles that really talk about those roles, architect, developer, operations, etc. And then you have these sort of spokes that talk about the considerations that we all have to think about throughout any software development process. And really kind of focusing on things like testability and securability, reliability, observability, et cetera. And so it was just a different model with which that I think we can focus on our work and utilize to go from there. So it's not done. It's put out there. My January and February goals to have more writing around it. I'm sure I'll write a book at some point. So more coming, but I'd love people's feedback and thoughts on it, how it kind of applies to their work.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm sure lots of you follow Emily. I'm sure it's been shared on Twitter, or if you want to share it again, so people can see where that is and they can go and give their input and be a part of helping you to evolve on it. I just gave you a task. I'm sorry.
Thank you. No, I love it. It's immediate.
I'm not a saint, but, but yeah. But, maybe we can get that out there so that people can be involved in that model. I think it really marries to what I think DevOps is trying to do, which is empowerment and getting other people involved rather than sort of a hierarchical top-down telling sort of model.
Yes. Yeah. No, I definitely think everything at this point should be community driven, and it has to be a sort of movement, not this one person thought leadering too much.
Yeah, I love it. So one last quick question. We've just got a couple minutes left. So I understand you are in the midst of writing another book. Can you tell us about it?
Yes. So I made a promise last spring that I would write a book on giving a tech talk. And so I hit a few setbacks at the start. I don't know about everyone else. There's been some things going on, some challenges.
Maybe one or two.
Yeah, well, a few things. So yeah, I was trying to protect my, long-term mental health and things like that. So it's been slow, but it's really about how to give a fantastic tech talk. And so I'm writing it right now. I'm really excited. It'll be an ebook, self-published. You can just grab it, but I'm excited about it. I think it's one of the most common questions I get, which is how I build a talk, how I, learn to speak. And so just kind of breaking down my process and my approach to it, I'm hoping will help people, build up the sort of gumption to get up on stage themselves and give their own talks and contribute to our community.
Oh, that's great. I can't wait to read it. I just got back into giving talks and I could use that too. So I can't wait to read it. Thank you so much for joining us. Our next session will be on February 1st, where we'll be speaking with Roy Oshervov. I'm so sorry. On his book, Elastic Leadership. And on the 1st of March, we'll be talking with Amachi, again, terrible with names, on her book, Getting Started in Tech. Thanks everybody again for joining us.
Thanks y'all, bye.